in himself vibrations by means of which, if he saturates the person infected with this terrible disease with those vibrations in a certain way, and in a certain successiveness of the flow of time, it is possible to destroy it entirely. Although afterwards, when we parted, we did not meet again for a long time, we always had news of one another. I knew that this young friend of mine, soon after we parted, married in his native country, and lived with his wife during the following years in full, as we say here in Asia, family love and mutual moral support. I was particularly interested in news of him which concerned his attainments in respect of the discovery of a cure for destroying in people just the aforesaid curse. Because the causes of the arising of just those vibrations, owing to which data for that disease are crystallized, were closely related to the causes, the elucidation of the vibrations of which were lately the chief interest in my life. I already knew that although he had not yet discovered any commonly accessible means of bringing about the destruction of that disease, yet, according to trustworthy reports which frequently reached me, he employed, for those who fell ill with this disease, the not commonly accessible practicable cures which he had first constated, and their actualization in practice which he had attained, and he had always achieved the complete destruction of this terrible human scourge. I received very authentic information about these favorable results achieved by him in some tens of cases during that time. Then it happened that for reasons not dependent on either of us, I had no information about that young European for about 10 years. I was already beginning to forget his existence entirely, when once, while I was specially absorbed in my occupations, I heard someone give our secret signal, and when I called and asked who was there, I at once recognized his voice. He asked me to make the way accessible for him to enter our underground domain. Needless to say, we were both glad to meet again and once more to exchange views on our beloved science of the laws of vibrations. When the excitement aroused by our new meeting had abated, and when we had unpacked all the things my young friend had brought on camels, among which, by the way, were some of the famous contemporary European what are called Roentgen apparatus, almost 50 elements of Bunsen, several accumulators, and several bales of different materials for electrical wiring, we began to talk quietly, and from what he related about himself, I learned with great grief the following. Several years before, when on account of higher world laws surrounding conditions and circumstances became such that scarcely anywhere on the earth did people have any security for the morrow or any settled dwelling place, he suddenly noticed the appearance in his beloved wife of just that terrible disease, the search for a cure for which had lately been one of the chief aims of his existence. He was particularly horrified because, in view of the surrounding conditions which had arisen, he had no possibility of employing for the destruction of that terrible disease that cure he had obtained, and which only he alone so far could actualize. And when he had calmed down somewhat after this terrible constatation, he then made the only possible decision, to wait patiently for a corresponding time, and meanwhile to try to create for his wife such conditions of life that the progressive process of that terrible disease should flow as slowly as possible. More than 2 years passed, during which time the surrounding conditions changed for the better, and this young friend of mine had the possibility of then preparing himself at last to employ that cure known only by him against that terrible disease. And when he had begun to prepare himself to employ that cure, then on one sorrowful day for him, in one of the large European cities, in the jostling caused by some demonstration, he fell under an automobile, and although not quite killed, he received very serious bodily injuries. Owing to these injuries, firstly, his own life flowed for several months under a lapse of memory, and secondly, because of the absence of conscious and intentional direction on his part of the ordinary life of his wife, the process of the terrible disease flowed in her at an accelerated tempo, chiefly because during his illness she took constant and anxious care of him without sparing herself. And so, when this poor friend of mine finally regained consciousness, he soon saw to his horror that the disease process in his wife was already in its last stages. What could he do? What could be done? Since, owing to the consequences of the injuries he had received, he was bereft of every possibility of preparing himself and of elaborating in himself the vibrations of the quality needed for the cure he had learned, of destroying in man that terrible disease. Thereupon, and in view of all this, and seeing no other way, he resolved to have recourse to that means of curing this illness which the representatives of contemporary European medicine employ, and thanks to which, they allege, it is possible, as it were, to destroy in man that disease. Namely, he decided to have recourse to what are called X-rays. The treatment with the said rays was begun. During the process of that treatment, he noticed that although the principal concentration and gravitational center of the disease in the body of his wife became, as it were, atrophied, yet at the same time, a similar concentration was beginning this time in an entirely different part of her body. After several months of repeated what they call, in Europe, séances, a similar independent concentration made its appearance in her, and this time in still a new place, the third. And as a result of it all, it transpired one sad day that the days of the invalid were numbered. Having constated this horror, my young friend decided to throw aside all the wiseacring of contemporary European medicine, and without consideration for his own state, he began to elaborate in himself the necessary vibrations, and to saturate the body of the invalid with them. Although, in spite of the difficulties almost insurmountable to him personally, he succeeded in prolonging the existence of his wife for almost 2 years. Yet, nevertheless, she finally died from just that terrible human disease. It must be noticed further that during the last period of the illness, when he had already ceased to employ the wiseacring of European medicine, 2 further similar independent concentrations were noticed in the body of his wife. When my young friend had more or less calmed down after that terrible issue, and again devoted part of his time to his beloved studies and researches of the great world laws, then, among other things, he became much interested to know why, during the treatment of the cancer by X-rays, there had arisen in the body of his wife those independent concentrations he had constated, which usually do not develop in this disease, and which, during his long years of previous observations, he had never noticed.